Picture this. It's 1942 in California's Central Valley, and a quiet Japanese farmer is planting strawberries that look completely wrong. They're pale, almost ghostly white. His neighbors gather at the fence, laughing so hard some are doubled over. One actually shouts, "Did you forget to add the red paint, Watanabe?" Another calls them ghost berries, and worse names I won't repeat here. But before we get into what happened next, do me a favor. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels, because what you're about to hear changed agriculture in America forever, and almost nobody knows his name. Now here's what makes this story absolutely extraordinary. This wasn't just some quirky farmer experimenting for fun. Masaru Watanabe was a man who understood something profound about survival, about adaptation, about seeing possibility where others saw only failure. And in 1942, as America entered its darkest hours of war, as Japanese families on the West Coast faced hatred and fear unlike anything they'd experienced before, one man's weird strawberries were about to expose everything wrong with judging by appearances. This is a story about innovation born from necessity, about quiet dignity in the face of mockery, and about how the thing everyone ridicules might just be the thing that saves them all. Masaru Watanabe didn't look like the kind of man who would revolutionize farming. He was 53 years old in 1942, with calloused hands, sun-weathered skin, and a back permanently bent from 30 years working California soil. He'd arrived from Japan in 1912 with $7 in his pocket, and a dream that was both simple and impossibly difficult: to farm his own land in America. For 3 decades, he'd worked as a farmhand on other people's property, saved every penny, absorbed every technique, studied every soil condition and weather pattern. He'd learned English by reading farming journals at night by candlelight. His neighbors knew him as the quiet Japanese man who worked harder than anyone they'd ever seen, but who never complained, never boasted, never demanded recognition. But here's what they didn't know. Masaru had been conducting experiments for 15 years. In a small corner of leased land, hidden from prying eyes, he'd been crossbreeding strawberry varieties with an obsessive precision that bordered on art. He wasn't just a farmer. He was a botanist, self-taught, working with the same methodical patience that had defined his entire immigrant experience. He'd studied how plants adapted to stress. He'd observed which varieties survived California's increasingly unpredictable droughts. He'd learned that sometimes what looks weak is actually evolution's answer to an impossible problem. His pale strawberries, what he privately called Shiro Ichigo, white strawberries, weren't a mistake. They were 15 years of accumulated wisdom, grown from carefully selected seeds that prioritize deep root systems and drought resistance over cosmetic appearance. By early 1942, Masaru had finally saved enough to lease 40 acres in Salinas Valley. It was marginal land that nobody else wanted. Dry, somewhat alkaline soil that conventional wisdom said couldn't support strawberries. But Masaru had been preparing for this moment his entire life. He knew this soil. He understood its chemistry. And he knew his pale berries could thrive where red ones would wither and die. So on a bright March morning, as war clouds gathered and fear rippled through California's Japanese community, Masaru began planting his life's work. The reaction was immediate and brutal. His nearest neighbor was Bob Henderson, a third-generation California farmer with 300 acres of prime land and an ego to match. Bob had conventional strawberries, big, red, beautiful berries that photographed like jewels and sold at premium prices. When Bob first saw Masaru's plants going into the ground, he actually drove his truck over to investigate, and what he saw made him laugh so hard he nearly fell over. "Watanabe, what in God's name are those things?" Bob's voice carried across the field, and other farmers started gathering. Within minutes, there was a small crowd at the fence line. Masaru straightened up slowly, his back aching, and walked over with quiet dignity. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson. These are strawberries. Special variety." "Special?" Bob's face was red with amusement. "They look like somebody bleached them. They look sick. Hell, they look like ghost berries." The crowd laughed, and the name stuck immediately. "Hey everyone, come see the ghost berries. Watanabe's growing ghost fruit." Tom Bradley, who ran the local agricultural supply store, pushed forward. Tom was the kind of man who'd never met a person of color he didn't feel superior to, and he wielded his small-town influence like a weapon. "Masaru, I'm going to give you some free advice, because I actually feel bad for you. You're wasting your money on bad seed. Come by my store. I'll set you up with real strawberry plants. American strawberries, red ones, the kind people actually buy." "Thank you, Mr. Bradley," Masaru said quietly. But these seeds are exactly what I need. What you need? Tom's face darkened. Listen, I don't know how you people did things back in Japan, but here in California strawberries are red. That's just a fact. You're making yourself look foolish. Martha Jennings, the self-appointed social arbiter of the farming community, chimed in with poisonous sweetness. Masaru dear, we're trying to help you. You're new to owning land. You don't want to be known as the farmer who grows weird Japanese trash. People talk, and right now, with the war, well, people are already talking. Her implication hung in the air like smoke. The crowd's laughter had edges now. Someone muttered something about Jap berries that got a few uncomfortable chuckles. Another voice called out, maybe they're white because they surrendered. The joke got a bigger laugh. Masaru stood there, surrounded by his neighbor's mockery, and something flickered across his weathered face. Not anger, not shame, but something deeper. Sadness, perhaps, for what this moment revealed about human nature. These strawberries, Masaru said, his voice still soft but carrying a steel underneath that made a few people actually pause, are designed for California's future, not its past. I understand you cannot see this yet. That is okay. California's future, Bob Henderson nearly choked. Buddy, I've been farming California for 3 generations. My grandfather planted the first strawberries in this county, and I'm telling you, those ghost berries of yours won't last a month. The soil's too dry in that plot. Everyone knows it. That's why that land's been sitting empty. Perhaps, Masaru said, that is exactly why it's the right land for these berries. The crowd erupted in fresh laughter. Tom Bradley shook his head in mock sympathy. Well, don't say we didn't warn you. I give it 6 weeks before you're back in my store begging for real seeds. He turned to the crowd. Folks, I think we're witnessing the most expensive mistake in Salinas Valley history. As the neighbors drifted away, still chuckling and shaking their heads, Masaru returned to his planting. His hands moved with practiced precision, setting each plant at exactly the right depth, at exactly the right spacing. He worked until sunset, and then by lantern light, and then into the next dawn. Alone. Always alone now, as the war had taken his 2 sons, not to combat, but to Manzanar, the internment camp, where they waited behind barbed wire because America had decided that Japanese ancestry meant Japanese loyalty. Masaru had been spared internment by a technicality. He was old enough and his agricultural contribution was deemed potentially necessary. But this made him even more isolated. He was a man caught between worlds. 2 Japanese for America, 2 American for Japan, trusted by neither, working land that everyone expected to fail. Over the following weeks, the mockery intensified. Every time Masaru went into town for supplies, he faced new humiliations. At the feed store, Tom Bradley had started calling them Watanabe's white flags, and the name spread like wildfire. At the diner, conversations would stop when he entered, then resume in exaggerated whispers just loud enough for him to hear. Heard his ghost berries are dying already. Serves him right for thinking he knows better than real Americans. Should have been sent away with the rest of them. Bob Henderson made a habit of driving by Masaru's farm, sometimes bringing friends to gawk at the strangest thing you'll ever see in agriculture. Martha Jennings organized her church ladies group to pray, loudly, publicly, for poor misguided Masaru to see the error of his foreign ways. Even the local agricultural board chairman, Douglas Pemberton, a pompous man who wore his authority like a crown, made a point of inspecting Masaru's farm and filing a formal report noting unconventional and likely unsustainable farming practices by immigrant farmer. But here's where the story gets interesting, because while everyone was laughing, while the mockery reached fever pitch, Masaru's strawberries were doing something remarkable. Those pale berries, planted in supposedly worthless soil, were thriving. Their root systems drove deep, finding moisture that conventional shallow-rooted berries couldn't reach. The pale color, rather than being a weakness, meant less sun damage in California's intense heat. And the genetic modifications Masaru had carefully bred into them over 15 years meant they required 70% less water than traditional varieties. By May 1942, when Bob Henderson's beautiful red strawberries were showing signs of stress from an early season drought, Masaru's pale berries were flourishing. But no one was paying attention yet. No one wanted to see. Because seeing would mean admitting they'd been wrong. And admitting they'd been wrong would mean confronting something far more uncomfortable. Their own prejudice. Then the war shortages began in earnest. By July, California agriculture was in crisis. The government had diverted irrigation water to military needs. Commercial fertilizers were rationed for war production. Most devastating of all, Japanese-American farmers, who'd grown nearly 40% of California's produce, had been removed to internment camps, creating catastrophic food shortages. The very people California had demonized and imprisoned were the ones who'd been feeding them. Bob Henderson's strawberry yields dropped by 60%. Other conventional farmers fared worse. The beautiful red berries everyone loved so much were dying in fields across the Central Valley. The agricultural supply chain that fed military bases, that sent produce to soldiers overseas, that kept California's cities fed, it was collapsing. And Masaru's pale strawberries? They were producing record yields. At first, nobody wanted to acknowledge it. Tom Bradley actually stopped by Masaru's farm in August, saw the abundant harvest, and turned his truck around without a word. Bob Henderson drove past twice, slowed down to stare, then accelerated away as if pursued by ghosts. The truth was too bitter to swallow. The weird Japanese trash was the only thing succeeding while American farming failed, but by September, desperation trumped pride. The military requisition office in Salinas, desperate to meet contracts for fresh produce to military bases, sent an inspector to evaluate Masaru's farm. The inspector was a young lieutenant named James Morrison, fresh from agricultural college, and he arrived expecting to find some kind of fluke or fraud. What he found instead left him speechless. "Mr. Watanabe," Lieutenant Morrison said, standing in a field of abundant pale strawberries, while conventional farms all around showed withered plants and bare soil. "I need to understand what I'm seeing here. According to our records, you're producing 3 times the yield of any other farm in the county. In the worst growing season in 20 years, with no supplemental irrigation. How is this possible?" Masaru, who'd been working since dawn, straightened slowly. "Would you like to see?" For the next 3 hours, Masaru gave Lieutenant Morrison an education. He showed him the root systems, how they extended 18 inches deep compared to conventional berries 6 inches. He explained the genetic selections he'd made over 15 years. He demonstrated how the pale color was actually a heat adaptation mechanism. He revealed soil chemistry calculations written in notebooks dating back to 1927, showing a level of scientific rigor that belonged in a university laboratory, not on a small farm. "This isn't luck," Morrison said finally, his voice filled with something between awe and shame. "This is genius. This is... Mr. Watanabe, do you understand what you've created? This could feed thousands of people. This could change California agriculture forever." "I understand," Masaru said quietly. "I have always understood." But no one wanted to listen to a Japanese farmer with weird strawberries. The silence that followed was profound. Lieutenant Morrison, to his credit, faced it head-on. "I owe you an apology. My country owes you an apology. What do you need? Resources? Labor? Government contracts? Name it." "I need," Masaru said, "to visit my sons in Manzanar. They are good boys. They understand plants like I do. They could help expand this, but they are behind wire because no one trusts them." Morrison's face went pale. Here was a man offering to save California's food supply, while his own sons were imprisoned by that same state. The moral weight of it was crushing. Within a week, everything changed. Lieutenant Morrison's report reached the Agricultural War Board in Sacramento. The board, facing catastrophic shortages and desperate to meet military contracts, had no choice but to act. They issued an emergency procurement contract to Masaru's farm, the largest contract ever given to a single strawberry producer in California history. The news spread through Salinas Valley like wildfire. And suddenly the neighbors who'd mocked Masaru for months went silent. But the real reckoning came at the town hall meeting called by Douglas Pemberton, the agricultural board chairman who'd filed that dismissive report months earlier. The hall was packed. Every farmer in the county was there, along with merchants, local officials, and journalists who'd gotten wind of the story. Pemberton stood at the podium, his usual pompous confidence notably shaken, and reluctantly invited Masaru to explain his methods to the farming community. Masaru stood slowly from the back row and walked to the front. The room was dead silent. You could feel the tension, the shame, the desperate need mixed with profound resentment. Here were people who'd called his work Japanese trash, who'd laughed at his ghost berries, who'd suggested he should be interned with the rest of them. And now they needed him, desperately. Bob Henderson sat in the front row, his face a mask of barely controlled anger and humiliation. Tom Bradley stood against the back wall, arms crossed, jaw clenched. Martha Jennings clutched her purse like a shield. These were people confronting the collapse of their worldview, and it was excruciating to watch. "Thank you for inviting me to speak," Masaru began, his voice soft but carrying perfectly in the silent room. I know many of you here have questions. I know some of you are angry. I understand this. Change is difficult. But I want to tell you something important. He paused, and the pause stretched until people started shifting uncomfortably. When I came to America 30 years ago, I had a dream. Not a complicated dream. I wanted to work hard, contribute something meaningful, maybe own a small piece of land. I wanted to be American. I learned your language. I studied your farming methods. I paid taxes. I sent my sons to American schools where they pledged allegiance every morning to the flag. And I believed, truly believed, that if I worked hard enough, if I was humble enough, if I made myself useful enough, I would be accepted. His voice caught slightly, and several people in the audience looked down at their hands. But I learned something painful these past months. I learned that no matter how hard I worked, no matter what I contributed, some people would only ever see me as the Japanese farmer. When my strawberries looked different, they were Jap berries. When my methods were unconventional, they were foreign ways. When I succeeded where you expected me to fail, some of you became angry rather than curious. Bob. Henderson's face was bright red now. Tom Bradley had uncrossed his arms and was staring at his boots. Martha Jennings was crying silently. But here is what I want you to understand, Masaru continued, and now his voice grew stronger, more resonant. I do not tell you this to shame you. I tell you this because we are at a moment where we can choose who we want to be. My strawberries are succeeding not because they are Japanese. They are succeeding because I spent 15 years studying this soil, this climate, this challenge. I succeeded because I listened to the land instead of listening to pride. He looked around the room, meeting eyes that couldn't hold his gaze. You called my berries ghost berries because they look wrong. But perhaps they look like ghosts because they are the future, appearing before you are ready to see it. You said these berries could never work in California. But they work because they are of California. Bred specifically for this soil, this heat, this water scarcity. You judged them by appearance, just as you judged me. The room was utterly still now. Pemberton, standing beside Masaru, looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. So here is what I propose, Masaru said, and his voice softened again into something almost gentle. I will share everything. Every technique. Every seed variety. Every calculation I've made. I will help any farmer in this valley transition to drought-resistant crops. I will do this freely, asking nothing in return except one thing. He paused, and the entire room leaned forward. Help me bring my sons home. They are in Manzanar right now, imprisoned because Americans like them are suspected of disloyalty. But my boys are Americans. They were born in California. They love this land as much as you do. They understand plants and soil and innovation. And they could help this valley produce enough food to feed military bases up and down the coast. But they cannot do this from behind barbed wire. The ontos silence that followed was deafening. Then slowly, improbably, Bob Henderson stood up. His face was working with emotion, shame, grief, something breaking loose inside him. Bob's voice cracked. I called your berries ghost berries. I laughed at you. I told people you were wasting your money, that you didn't know what you were doing because you weren't from here. Tears were streaming down his weathered face now. But the truth is, I've been farming this valley my whole life, and you understood this soil better in 30 years than I ever did. You're a better farmer than I'll ever be. And instead of learning from you, I mocked you. Because I was scared. Scared that everything I thought I knew was wrong. Scared that someone who looked different and talked different might be better than me. And that fear made me cruel. Bob turned to face the room. Masaru just offered to save our farms. To share everything he's learned, freely, after how we treated him. After we called his life's work Japanese trash. He's offering us grace we don't deserve. And I'm standing here to say, I'll do whatever it takes to help get his sons home. Whatever it takes. It's the least we owe him. It's the very least. Slowly, person after person stood up. Tom Bradley, his voice shaking. I'm in. I'll write to every government representative I know. Martha Jennings openly sobbing. I'll organize the whole church. We'll petition. We'll fundraise if we need to. Douglas Pemberton. His bureaucratic pomposity finally stripped away. I'll use every ounce of influence I have at the state level. This is wrong. All of it is wrong. What happened next became legendary in California agricultural history. Masaru Watanabe didn't just share his techniques, he mentored an entire valley through agricultural transformation. He spent weeks at other farms, getting his hands dirty, patiently explaining root systems and soil chemistry and drought adaptation. The man who'd been mocked for foreign ways became the most sought-after expert in California agriculture. But more than that, he became a symbol. The farmers who'd been organized by Bob Henderson and Martha Jennings launched an intensive lobbying campaign for internment camp releases, specifically targeting agricultural workers. Tom Bradley used his supply store as a petition headquarters, collecting thousands of signatures. Douglas Pemberton wrote daily letters to Sacramento, using his political connections to push for policy changes. It took 6 months, 6 agonizing months. But in March 1943, Masaru's sons, Kenji and Hiroshi Watanabe, were among the first Japanese Americans released from internment camps through the Agricultural Worker Program. The day they returned, the entire farming community showed up at Masaru's farm. These same neighbors who'd laughed at his weird strawberries stood in his fields and applauded as his sons came home. But the truly remarkable part of this story is what happened after. Kenji and Hiroshi, rather than harbor resentment, joined their father in helping transform Central Valley agriculture. Together, the Watanabe family developed drought-resistant varieties of not just strawberries, but tomatoes, lettuce, and berries. Their techniques, shared freely with anyone who asked, helped California agriculture survive the war years and thrive in the decades after. By 1945, an estimated 40,000 acres of California farmland had adopted Watanabe agricultural methods. The pale strawberries that had been mocked as ghost berries were now officially designated California Victory Berries by the Agricultural War Board and became a symbol of innovation and resilience. The Watanabe farm became a teaching center where farmers from across the state came to learn. Bob Henderson, true to his word, became one of Masaru's closest friends and most devoted students. He wrote in his personal diary, discovered years later, "I spent my whole life thinking I knew farming, because I'd inherited land and technique from my grandfather. But Masaru taught me that real mastery comes from listening. To the land, to new ideas, to people who see the world differently than you do. My pride nearly destroyed me and definitely blinded me to genius growing right next door. I'm grateful he gave me a chance to become better." Martha Jennings converted her church basement into a community center, where Japanese American families released from internment camps could find temporary housing and support. She spent the rest of her life advocating for redress and reconciliation, driven by what she called the shame of judging strawberries by their color and people by their origin. Tom Bradley transformed his agricultural supply store into a cooperative that prioritized helping small and immigrant farmers access supplies at fair prices. He hung a framed photo of Masaru's pale strawberries behind his counter with a handwritten sign. "The most beautiful fruit is sometimes the least conventional. Never judge possibility by appearance." Masaru Watanabe passed away in 1967 at the age of 78. His funeral was attended by over 3,000 people, including the governor of California, who officially proclaimed a day of recognition for Watanabe's contributions. But perhaps the most moving tribute came from the valley farmers themselves, who planted an entire memorial field of pale strawberries, now affectionately called Watanabe Whites, that blooms every spring as a living reminder of one man's quiet revolution. So what's the lesson here? What can we take from the story of a humble Japanese farmer whose weird strawberries saved California from starvation? First, true innovation often looks wrong before it looks right. The most revolutionary ideas frequently appear ridiculous, impractical, or foolish to those invested in the status quo. Masaru's pale strawberries violated every aesthetic expectation of what a strawberry should look like, but that unconventional appearance was precisely what enabled their extraordinary function. Before you mock something unfamiliar, ask yourself, am I judging by appearance or by genuine understanding? Second, prejudice blinds us to genius. The same neighbors who ridiculed Masaru's methods would have eagerly learned from those identical techniques if they'd been presented by someone who looked like them, spoke like them, and had the right background. Their racism didn't just hurt Masaru. It hurt themselves, delaying their own salvation by months because they couldn't see past their biases. How much wisdom are we missing in our own lives because we've decided in advance who is and isn't worth listening to? Third, humility is not weakness. It's revolutionary strength. Masaru could have responded to mockery with anger, could have hoarded his knowledge when his neighbors finally came begging, could have demanded recognition and compensation before helping. Instead, he offered grace. He shared freely. He helped the very people who tried to break him. And in doing so, he didn't just save farms, he transformed hearts. Real strength isn't about dominating others, it's about lifting others even when they haven't earned it. Fourth, redemption requires action, not just words. Bob Henderson and his fellow farmers didn't just apologize. They spent months fighting to bring Kenji and Hiroshi home. They put their time, influence, and reputation on the line. They didn't just say they'd changed, they proved it through sacrifice. True remorse always manifests in changed behavior and concrete amends. Finally, the thing you mock today might save you tomorrow. Life has a way of humbling our certainties. The ghost berries that seemed like laughable failures became California's salvation. The foreign ways that seemed inferior became the blueprint for agricultural survival. The person you dismissed as unworthy became the one everyone needed. This should make us cautious about our judgments and curious about our blind spots. Masaru Watanabe's story is ultimately about seeing. Really seeing. Not the surface, not the appearance, not the prejudice, but the truth underneath. Those pale strawberries looked wrong because we were looking wrong. We expected red, so we called white a failure. We expected conventional, so we called innovation foolish. We expected conformity, so we called difference dangerous.